Guten Morgen, good morning to this last day of our workshop, and we're starting with a panel, Gendered Experiences of the Holocaust, LGBTQI plus. And Miriam Wilhelm will chair this panel. I will introduce her to you. For those of you who haven't been introduced to her, she is part of this organizational team of this workshop as well. And she studied art history and curatorial studies at Trier University and Goethe University Frankfurt am Main. She holds a PhD from the Institute of Art and Visual Culture at Karl von Ossietzky University Oldenburg and joined the VWI in January 2021. We are very happy about that. And she's very involved in all the ERI projects here at the Institute. Previously, she worked as a research assistant at Yale University and at the interdisciplinary Frankfurt Humanities Research Center, curating the digital image database for the project Erinnerungspolitik und Bildgebrauch. She has received several fellowships, for instance, from the German Academic Scholarship Foundation and from the Selma Stern Center for Jewish Studies, Berlin-Brandenburg. Her research interests encompass the visual history of the Holocaust, Jewish women artists under Nazi persecution, digital humanities, as well as gender and queer studies. Most recent publications, Vera Billa and the Neo-Byzantine, a Jewish avant-gardist in Budapest, Berlin, Belgrade, and beyond. And yes, we are looking forward to this panel, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Marianne, for the introduction, and welcome everyone to our first panel, Gendered Experiences of the Holocaust, LGBTIQ. And it's my pleasure to be the designated chair for this session, which will add to our discussion on gendered perspectives, yet another very important marginalized voice. Before I introduce today's speakers, let me just briefly update you again on the latest changes in this panel. Unfortunately, as you know, Rosie Ramsden had to cancel and she will not be with us today. But on a more positive note, this will give us ample time for our first and only presentation by Noah Munier and Karl-Heinz Steinle. Warm welcome to both of you, and also for our discussion. And we will also get to enjoy a small break before jumping into our final panel at 10:30 a.m. So now, without much further ado, I'm happy to introduce today's speakers in alphabetical order. So Noah Munier and Karl-Heinz Steinle. Noah Munier holds a PhD in Art and Culture Studies. Since 2016, she's a member of the research project LGBTIQ in Baden und Württemberg, Lebenswelten, Repression und Verfolgung im Nationalsozialismus und in der Bundesrepublik Deutschland at the Department of Contemporary History at the University of Stuttgart. Her research focuses on state repressions under the notorious Paragraph 175 in Baden-Württemberg. Previously, she held a doctoral fellowship at the DFG Doctorate Collegium Selbstbildungen, Praktiken der Subjektivierung in historischer und interdisziplinärer Perspektive. And that was at the Karl von Ossietzky University in Oldenburg. She has published widely on the subject, and among her recent publications are her dissertation, Sexualisierte Nazis, erinnerungskulturelle Subjektivierungspraktiken in Deutungsmustern von Nationalsozialismus und italienischem Faschismus, which was published by Transcript in 2017, and which we also hold here at the VWI Library. And most recently Lebenswelten und Verfolgungsschicksale homosexueller Männer in Baden und Württemberg im 20. Jahrhundert, which was published just this year by Kohlhammer, and which has inspired today's presentation that will look into the persecution of bi and homosexual men under the Nazi regime and subsequently in West Germany until 1969. Karl-Heinz Steinle, MA, is a historian, Slavist, and researcher for public history within the same project, LGBTIQ in Baden and Württemberg at the University of Stuttgart. His research encompasses, amongst others, studies on homosexuality in Russia and the former Soviet Union. From 2009 until 2013, he served as the director of the Schules Museum Berlin. As a historian, he is involved in the exhibition project Quer durch Tübingen and works for the Archiv der anderen Erinnerungen by the Bundesstiftung Magnus Hirschfeld. Karl-Heinz, Noah, thank you very much for joining us today from Germany. We are very much looking forward to your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mirjam, for your kind introduction. I'm giving my presentation to everybody. 1 second, please. So I hope you can see it now. And as far as I recognized, we are the only speakers on this panel, but I hope it's going to be an intense exchange afterwards. And I think there are very much possibilities for exchange, and we see a lot of similarities but also differences in our approaches to precarious archives. Today, we would like to present methodological challenges as well as approaches to solutions in historiographical research on the life, worlds, and persecution fates of homosexual and bisexual men. The following considerations and approaches were developed in the context of a research module at the University of Stuttgart on life, worlds, or habitats and persecution fates of homosexual men in southwestern Germany between 1919 and 1969. We talk about life worlds as meaning the habitats, social practices, or subcultures. As you can see, the research transcends the context of Nazi history, which is also related to the continued validity of Section 175 German Penal Code in the Nazi version in the Federal Republic of Germany. The Section 175 was introduced in 1872 and criminalized male homosexual encounters. It was amended and broadened by the Nazis in 1935. As such, it was part of the German Penal Code until 1969. It was finally abolished in 1994. And unlike in Austria, the paragraph was only addressing homosexual men. The research module is part of a larger research project on LGBTIQ history in Baden and Württemberg, life worlds, repression and persecution under National Socialism and in the Federal Republic of Germany. And it is complemented by a public history project where you can see the website now. Unfortunately, I've heard there's a little bit lost on top of the page. Thus, this is a regional study on the region of Baden-Württemberg. However, the methodological considerations and approaches are likely to be relevant beyond the German Southwest. As a scholar, I had the task of researching habitats and subcultures as well as the persecution of homosexual and bisexual men in this particular context. In addition to the persecution, my study also aimed to explore the habitats and subcultures in the Weimar Republic, during the Nazi era, and in the young Federal Republic of Germany, and thus those that were mostly hidden due to Section 175 and state repression. To this end, I first turned to archival sources in rather traditional archives, that is state, regional, and city archives. In the course of my research, I found that these archives housed primarily, if not exclusively, documents from the persecutorial institutions. In this sense, their collection structure was thus highly precarious, at least at first glance, with regard to the value to the study of habitats and subcultures of homo and bisexual men. In the archives, I came across documents of the persecution institutions, such as criminal statistics, criminal files, police files, prison files, files from sanatoriums or so-called Heil- und Pflegeanstalten, documents of the highest state authorities, like the Ministry of Justice. Thus, I focused mainly on files and file inventories that had been identified in the collection structure of those archives by the keyword paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code. As such, a search for material using other keywords such as homosexuality, homosexuals, or homosexual men, let alone contemporary terms such as homophile, which was quite common in the 1950s and 1960s, or friendship love, Freundesliebe, that the associations of homosexual and bisexual men in the 1920s used hardly led to any results. As you can see here on the screenshot of the search engine of the State Archive Baden-Württemberg, 0 hits appear while searching for the term homophile. However, it could seem quite problematic and possibly not very productive to inform our understanding of habitats or subcultures when they are documented and reconstructed primarily on the basis of archival legacies of the persecuting authorities and institutions. At first, the apparent objection seemed justified. But what exactly do those sources of persecution institutions provide information about? And can they possibly be made fruitful? How could such sources provide insights into subcultures or habitats? And how must historiographical research be conceptualized in order to explore and document the lives of homosexual men by means of these archival legacies of the persecuting authorities? I would like to briefly discuss the source genre of prisoner and criminal trial records in order to elaborate on this. With that, I like to refer to the work of Michael Budrus, who researched the history of the persecution of homosexual men as well in a regional context. The possible historiographical gain of knowledge from prisoner files, for example, is quite plentiful. Prisoner files, if applicable, also verdicts contained therein, provide information about, for example, the personal circumstances of the prisoners. They contain information about the aim, age, name, origin, nationality, and religion of the convicts. They contain information about the circumstances of the so-called crime, the legal provisions invoked, and the sentence. The file shows how the offense became known to the police authorities or the judiciary. And it is possible that we learn about denunciations as well, such as family members actually turning over their relatives for homosexual behavior. The evaluation of these sources also allow us to draw conclusions about the institutions and actors of the persecution. With regard to the persecuting institutions, it becomes clear which departments, such as the Criminal Investigation Department, the Vice Squad, Sittenpolizei, or during the Nazi era, the Gestapo conducted the investigations. Sometimes a special responsibility is recognizable. It also shows which courts dealt with the prosecution of the criminal complex surrounding Section 175. The files give us information on judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys. Prisoner files also provide information on the details of the sentences against homo and bisexual men, on the state of their health, on prison conditions such as disciplinary measures, and sometimes also on criminal psychological assessments by prison doctors and the like. Here you can see a document from a prison file which shows internal disciplinary measures. This person was denied a bed to sleep for 3 days in 1937 in a prison in Karlsruhe because he handed a secret message to another homosexual inmate. In the middle, you can see Bettenentziehung. In addition, and this at least hints at how these sources can possibly not only provide information about the fates of persecution, but also enable further insights into subcultures and habitats. In quite a few cases, the letters of a prisoner to his relatives, withheld by the prison censors and preserved in the prison file, might be a witness to the personal conditions of the convict, the behavior of his family, close friends, and everyday life inside and outside the prison. It can thus be stated that by means of these sources, we receive insights into the lives of homosexual men, despite being filtered through the specific perspective of the prosecuting authorities. Conclusions about the subcultures of homosexual men are also possible in the source group of criminal case files, for example, in judgments and in indictments, where the starting point and narrative of homosexual acts are described in detail. In addition to documents already mentioned, they may also contain evidence to be classified as ego documents, such as diaries and appointment calendars, but also journals, photographs, private correspondences between friends, lovers, and partners, as well as correspondences with official representatives of homosexual organizations and much more. Whenever the life of homo and bisexual men collide with the law, the evidence, also magazines, photographs, and the like, was archived as well. Here you can see documents of homosexual cultures in Württemberg in the 1920s, like an invitation to a friendship circle or correspondences from the Black Forest region. Criminal trial, prison, and police records pertaining to homo or bisexual men can thus also enable our research both in the context of state repression, such as prisons, but also in part of subcultures beyond the penal institutions. In order to reduce the lives and habitats to the realities of repression, in order not to reduce the lives and habitats to the realities of repression and persecution, it seems necessary to supplement the source corpus with additional sources. These include further private documents such as photographs, publications of the homosexual emancipation movements, contemporary film, literature, artistic representations, or sexual political discourse of the respective period. I also had the opportunity to evaluate testimonies and interviews with contemporary witnesses that Karl-Heinz Steinle and Andreas Pretzel, among others, conducted for the Archive of Other Memories, das Archiv der anderen Erinnerungen of the Federal Foundation Magnus Hirschfeld, Bundesstiftung Magnus Hirschfeld. We also asked ourselves questions about what other source types and files of the persecutorial institutions we could gain information about the subcultures, like, for example, Konzessionsakten, restaurant permits, files, or criminal files that were about indecent behavior. Because these sources of the persecution institutions possibly only provide limited information, the supplementation of these sources by further sources is vital. Furthermore, I suggest an investigation of habitats and subcultures through the perspective of a historiography that is informed by cultural studies. With this diversity of sources, we can approach our investigation from a praxiological research perspective. In this perspective, we focus on habitats and subcultures that are produced in the sense of doing culture through performative practices. In this context, habitats and subcultures are not to be understood as social cultural background of social practices, but are understood as being produced within and through historical social practices. These practices include, for example, discursive practices, practices of meaning production like representations and writings, but also the performative practice of historical actors and thus their interactions, for example, in dancing or listening to music. We try to concentrate on practices like doings, sayings, writings, or image making. Accordingly, practices are to be analyzed, for instance, in their written private correspondences about which love letters provide information. This also includes everyday testimonies and ego documents by means of which it is possible to draw conclusions such as about public and private places of gathering and their use. This raises not only the question of the specific topographies of homosexual subcultures, for example, the sites and places where homo and bisexual men met, but also of how homo and bisexual men, perhaps also in conjunction with other sexual and gender identities, shaped these spaces. With this approach on subcultures and practices of the homosexual men, we aimed to see them not only as victims and persecuted subjects, but as actors and subjects with agency. With that, I would like to hand the floor over to my colleague, Karl-Heinz Steinle, who will now demonstrate this for a very special place in Tübingen, den Salon der 100.
So I think it's all, do you see me and do you see this the display? Okay.
Yes.
Oh, I don't, sorry. This does not function today. We tried it yesterday, I'm sorry.
I can do it for you if you'd like.
Would you do it for me? This would be great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
1 second, please, again. You're sharing your screen, that's why I can't enter it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Noah. Hello to everyone. Now I'll start. Sorry for this interruption. Yes, as an example of such a place, Noah mentioned, which one could perhaps also call a space of possibility, I would like to introduce the Salon der 100 in Tübingen, a town in southern Baden-Württemberg with a university since the Middle Ages. The Salon der 100 existed from 1969 till 1977 and is a good example of how our research supplemented the files of the persecution institutions Noah mentioned before with other sources, such as interviews and private photographs. The research on the Salon der 100 also made it possible to obtain sources for the Tübingen City Archive, which are now included in its collection structure and further queer the archive. Salon der 100 was the name of the club rooms of an association of the same name founded by a group of young people in the summer of 1969. They used a very common strategy, namely the creation of free spaces by founding an association which protects them. This made it possible to circumvent requirements of the law on restaurants, which also created fewer opportunities for state and municipal authorities to intervene. On display is a photo taken in the early 1960s. It shows house facades in the Neckarhalde in Tübingen. This street runs below Tübingen Castle, you would see on the left side, and faces the Neckar River on the edge of the medieval old town. In the photo to the left of the massive building with the inscription Gaststätte zur Traube, the building on the right hand, you can see a smaller and rather inconspicuous house. Here on the first floor, the Salon der 100 had its club rooms. And it's hard to imagine that sometimes up to 100 people partied and gathered there until the early morning. The Salon der 100 opened in July 1969, 1 month after the German Bundestag had passed the criminal law reform, in German, die große Strafrechtsreform. And this included the liberalization of the outdated sexual penal law. This meant, for example, that consensual sexual acts between men over the age of 21 were no longer punishable. Male homosexuality in Germany was, in part at least, decriminalized after almost 100 years. But other laws also liberalized with the reform, such as the pimping law, in German, this would be in Kuppelei, which punished the creation of opportunities for so-called fornication, but could also always be used against liberal families, landlords, or club owners. Next photo, please. Thanks. The Salon der 100 was, as I said at the beginning, a registered association with statutes. The aims of the association were to promote young artists and to deal with modern art in words, writing, and pictures. It organized changing exhibitions, readings, discussion evenings, and concerts. This photo here shows the singer-songwriter Christoph Stählin in front of an artistic work on display. However, as with all clubs, the main concern was socializing, inspiration, and getting to know each other in a protected space, and so on and so on. This did not exclude concrete political activities. In the Salon der 100, these people met each other, who later on were involved in the founding of the Initiative Homosexuality Tübingen in 1973, and Tübingen's children's shop movement by feminists, in German this would be Kinderladenbewegung, has also its origins here. Only members of the association and their guests were admitted in the salon, as it says in the statutes, of July 14th in 1969. This was a guarantee of protection on one hand, and also meant exclusivity, but on the other hand, of course, it also excluded people. Next, please. Next. We know from conversations with contemporary witnesses that the club rooms of the Salon der 100 must have been very specially decorated. Until now, we assumed that there were no photos of the interior. We know this because for reasons of self-protection. No photos were taken in queer clubs in Germany, in queer clubs and bars until the 1980s, because they could always have been used against those who are pictured. But a contemporary witness recently showed us his album, and we were allowed to take photos from it, including the ones I'm showing here today. Once the guests had made themselves known by ringing the bell at the front door on the ground floor of the Neckarhalde, and once the door was opened for them, which not always was the case, another world opened up behind the harmless house facade. The fact that this world could also fascinate non-members is shown by the report of the inspection of the clubrooms by the Tübingen Building Regulations Office, in German Bauordnungsamt, on July 10th, 1969, whose positive decision was the prerequisite for opening the Salon der 100. The report is in the restaurant files of the Tübingen City Archive, and I quote from it now. The tap room is reached through a 4-meter-long hallway lined with gold, yellow, and silver foil, and a staircase covered with a red carpet. One enters the room via an area covered with rice straw mats, which ends at the end of the bar table on the left. This is also the border to the 4-to-4-meter room. This room is completely covered with a large, incredible soft red floor carpet. In the middle of this Bohemian hall, a large glass bowl filled with water lies on the floor, in which flower arrangements are inserted according to the season, in brackets, currently water lilies. Around the laid-out flower arrangements are 2 large skins, an oriental seat cushion, and 2 wicker chairs as a seating for the guests. End of quote. As an association, it was possible to circumvent questions of licensing and requirements of the Catering Act, in German Gaststättengesetz. There were no fixed prices. The drinks were given away for a donation. And the closing time was also interpreted very generously. This was an important reason for the attractiveness of the salon and led to frequent complaints to the police from the neighborhood for disturbing the nighttime peace. Next photo, please. Thanks. The Salon der 100 was a mixed club. All guests were club members and their friends, including many homosexual and bisexual men and women and people who today might identify as trans or queer. This mixture of members and guests was one of the main attractions of the salon. The salon often stayed open until 4 a.m. because, and here is a quote from the association's application for curfew reduction, in German, Sperrzeitverkürzung, from March 1973, which is also in the Tübingen City Archives. I quote, "It does not need to be emphasized that communication in general cannot be limited in time. In addition, theater people can often only join us in the club after 1 a.m. after detours, rehearsals, after dinner talks, meals." End of quote. Among the prominent guests were many queer artists. For example, the jazz singer Inge Brandenburg, totally forgotten today, the dancer Marcia Haydée from Stuttgart Ballet, who is living in the age of 95, or the then director of the Tübingen Zimmertheater, Salvatore Pordinet. The majority of the guests, however, were young students. And although the club is also disparagingly denounced in the files as an establishment, which means brothel, and although the guests were not infrequently insulted on the street as bumps, hippies, and dope brothers, and female guests were harassed, it can nevertheless be stated that, compared to the 50s or 60s, a paradigm shift took place, and that the city of Tübingen granted its female and male students a free space. At least that is how I read the following passage in the Ordnungsamt's report, from which I quote again. The bar counter is about 1.4 meter high, covered with purple velvet, and offers space for 7 bar stools. Drinks served are Coca-Cola, whiskey, and tea. The latter is supplied by a Russian samovar, which stands in a corner of the Bohemian room. The disorder found in the room itself, and especially at the bar, can be excused by the informal artistic life of those responsible for the bar. The bar doesn't give the impression of a so-called nep local, but rather that of a classic Bohemian neighborhood. End of quote. And next photo, please, Noah. Thanks. The central figure of the Salon der 100 and the stubborn defender against any kind of closure, threats, for example, for disturbing the nighttime peace or using cannabis, was Lilith Schunemann. You would see on the left, who was born in 1941. Throughout Tübingen, she was known only as Shan. In the Salon der 100, but also outside the club, she was dressed only in black, had hair dyed black, and usually as a contrast, a lightly powdered face with red lips. Presumably, there were clear messages and borrowings from the style of the French singer Juliette Gréco. Her strictly black outfit was a commitment to the non-color of the existentialists, and their chansons were often played in the club. At any rate, Shan's appearance seemed strange to the Tübingen authorities. In the margin of a sheet from the pub's files, there is a handwritten note next to her name, "Caution the bad." Also, Shan was a public figure in Tübingen and was very important to many people. Little is known about her. In the Salon's file, she is described as a well-known artist, and graphic artist is given as her profession. After the closure of the Salon der 100 in 1977, she is said to have worked in fashion industry in Stuttgart. Shan kept her private life protected. According to the registration card of the city of Tübingen, she was married to a Greek for a short time. However, she is said to have loved men and women. In an interview, the actress and cabaret artist Maren Kreumann, who was born in Tübingen and who is nowadays the most well-known lesbian woman in German entertainment industry, told me that she had been to the Salon der 100 for the first time in 1969 when she was 19, and that she perceived Shan there as a lesbian woman, and that this was more or less the very first lesbian she ever had seen in her life, which then made a lasting impression on her. Next, please. Thanks. It therefore often depends on just one person, in my example, Lilith Schunemann, whether a space of possibility was established and how long such in a meeting place could exist. The landlords, owners and premises concession holders or simply hosts, and their important role for emancipation movements as well as anti-emancipation movements have not been taken into account by research so far. We therefore would like to call for research in general, in history, sociology, regional studies, but also in economic history, for example, not only to focus more on such spaces of possibility, but also to research those responsible and their commitment to these spaces of freedom and liberty. They functioned as persons of trust and guarantors of security. And before there were public institutions for LGBT+ and others, they were the first and for a very long time the only ones who created, designed, and often also defended free and protected spaces. We would like to see research questions such as: where did lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, transgender, and queer people meet? How and for what purpose could these places be used? How did the audience mix? How did these places define themselves? Where were they accessible or generally known or only for insiders? Could they be advertised? And if so, in what form? What distinguished the places? What did the spaces look like? What was the program? Or was there a program? Like, for example, this kind of erotic art performance you see on display. Could the spaces only be used by people who assigned themselves to a category? Did the use of these spaces require money? And did this exclude some users? How private were these meeting places? We would also like to ask questions about the owners, actors, and makers. What were their motives for getting involved? What risks did they take? What strategies and protective measures did they use? We are also interested in finding out whether there was repression against owners or visitors, for example, controls, raids, arrests, surveillance, stalking, denunciations. Or whether authorities such as the police, the Public Order Office, the Health Office, the Economic Office, or the Economic Control Service imposed restrictive conditions. Or how the neighborhood reacted to meeting places and free spaces. Or how dangerous it was to go to such meeting places and to leave them in the late night, for example. All of these questions generate new information that can be used to re-interrogate, re-evaluate, and thus enhance archival holdings. The conversations with the contemporary witnesses from new additional sources and archives. With this act of queering the archives, we hope that future researchers will have a better starting point than we had. And we hope that those responsible for the archives and collections will understand this as enriching their archives. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for giving us these truly exciting insights into your research and also the methodological approach you're employing for this fundamental research project. To me, your analysis of the institutionalized persecution and the case studies between 1920 and 1977 was really compelling, and I was intrigued by the emphasis that you put on agency as well as practice and what you've called spaces of possibility. I would be very interested actually in hearing your thoughts, your further thoughts on the question how your research translates back into the archive, because reading against the grain has been such a prominent and also recurring theme during the discussion over the last 2 days. So I was wondering along those lines if you could elaborate on this potential of queering the archive with your research. Then also another thing that came to mind for me was during your presentation, Noah, where you mentioned the persecution files that also include files from sanatoriums and the so-called Heil- und Pflegeanstalten. So I was wondering about the need for intersectional analysis, basically as an approach for doing this research of LGBTIQ communities under Nazism, but also afterwards, because we know that homosexuality was defined as a mental disorder. Also, we know about the quote-unquote euthanasia programs that played a vital role in this persecution in Germany and in Austria. And along those lines, also the fact that I read that up yesterday, that the first prisoner registered at the Mauthausen camp in 1939 1989 was a Jewish man from Vienna who was arrested not only for being Jewish, but also on the criminal charges of homosexual conduct. So there is a significant overlap also in these categories of persecution, which I think needs to be taken into account. So I would be really interested in hearing your thoughts on this. And Karl-Heinz, for you, I was very intrigued about the archive of other memories and those interviews that you briefly showed. And if I remember correctly, you are also involved in conducting these interviews. So I would be very interested in if you could give us some more details. How do these interviews work, and how does the database that is accessible online, how does it work? What's the access situation? What are the legal, political, ethical ramifications of this database? And also, I browsed the website yesterday, and I came across what looked to me like a call for contributors who are actually willing to give testimony. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on this. Had you had any? How are the responses, and what's the procedure? I noted down a whole bunch of other questions, but I will now stop myself and also open up the floor for comments and questions from the audience. Thank you.
Shall I direct the answer, or is now first
yeah, maybe you could do maybe a quick round of answers to my abundance of questions, and then we collect questions from the audience. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect.
Querying the archive and our experiences with that, and how we approach that huge project. Sometimes it's about very little steps and about communication in the first place with directors of archives, with people who work in the archives to present your project and to make accessible those files which are important for us. And with this communication, sometimes we experience in the beginning hesitation, and also because this file group, especially the criminal files, but also, of course, files from so-called Heil- und Pflegeanstalten, they are highly sensitive medical files. And so there's a hesitation was a hesitation sometimes to open this spaces for us. But then once we've communicated with the directors and also of small city archives, we experienced mostly a huge interest and also a need for expertise in those spaces. And we were more and more welcomed to do the work that is necessary to do, and also the people who work in the archive, the directors, we opened their eyes for treasures that are there, like letters from Magnus Hirschfeld, for example, from homosexual organizations of the 1920s. A lot of those associations by name are not known to, or haven't been known to people who indexed those files. Yeah, so those files were indexed by Section 175, but sometimes we find newspapers of Der Kreis or even letters from sexual scholars at the time, Hans Giese, for example, in the 1950s. So that is already part of querying the archive. There is a lot of material already there, but it is not possible to see it through the lens of the index of the archive, yeah. And so making that available is very, very important, I think, but also, and Karl-Heinz might elaborate on that a little bit further with an example from Tübingen, or also with this album of photographs now, our research, activates people to participate. That's also part of our public history project. If Karl-Heinz, if you would like to share that example from Tübingen, for example.
Maybe two, 3 sentences. I would say what querying the archive means is first the contact to the as Noah mentioned, to the directors of archival holdings and private archives too. But then it also invokes the activities of the archives itself. Then in future time they could archive them. They should reread their archive they do have in their holdings, and for future times they should they should clarify their archive, or when they get new holdings, they will write, these are also queer holdings. So for future researchers, this would be possible to find much more easily than we had this example. There is one nice example of the research project Queer Through Tübingen, which is going on since 2017. In the Tübingen City Archives, there has been a book since years, which was a book full of poems and love letters. And this book was handed out to the City Archive by the son of a former priest of a prison. And according to the project Queer durch Tübingen, the Polish historian Joanna Ostrowska wrote and researched a very interesting and intrigued love relation between a Polish man and a German. And the German has been sentenced because of paragraph 175. And this German man was in that prison where that book was written. And it turned out after Joanna Ostrowska and Udo Rauch from the City Archive of Tübingen compared the way of writing, it turned out that that book the Tübingen Archive had for already 10 years, that this is the love letter poem book written by that man who was in love with this Polish guy and who sat in prison because of 175. So these poems can now be reread as love letters, as poems from one man and love poems from one man to the other. This is maybe one little hint how this would enrich and enhance archive holdings.
Wonderful, thank you.
I can also go on with your question about intersectional analysis, which is super important, I think, because in the research on especially the Nazi era, we tend to focus on the categories that were established by the Nazi regime, and we absolutely need to look and look further and broaden the categories in a way, and to see what it meant to be part of different persecuted groups. Yeah, and also in my study on Lebenswelten und Verfolgungsschicksalen homosexueller Männer in Baden-Württemberg, I'm absolutely doing that, and I'm also concentrating on what it meant to be as a homosexual man, be held in a Heil- und Pflegeanstalt, and where there are possibilities of advantages, but also how that impacted persecution, and this could rather put them further in danger. And of course, also homosexual Jews, all of those categories, it's so important that we focus on them and to broaden our vision and for this intersectional analysis. Yeah, that's for future research on the subject, very vital. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Noah.
Maybe some sentences to the Archive of Other Memories, Archiv der anderen Erinnerungen. This archive was invented in 2015, and in between, I think there are around 75 or 80 interviews in this archive. These interviews are made by 3 persons, one camera person and 2 interviewers of different sexes mainly. And the people who had been interviewed, they are in between. There are a lot of lesbian women, bisexual men and women, homosexual men, and also, which is new, trans people, and in future also inter people. Mostly they are of an old age, in between 70 or even, I interviewed one man who was nearly 100. And mostly at the beginning, mostly these people had kind of persecution experiences. But, and the setting of the interview is also, you have a whole day, you stay together and you can ask and talk and create an atmosphere and a room of possibilities to where they can tell what they want about their life in general. And this evokes incredible, interesting interviews, which are partly 5 or 6 or 7 hours long or less. And this gives them their voices back. In a way, the first aim was to give people voices back who had no voices in German history writing. And then the second aim was to give people their own voices and not victimized voices. And then I think the third aim is to give the people the possibility to show their diversity and variety and facets of life, and not to be only focused on maybe their homosexuality, their bisexuality, or their intersectionality. And I think this is a question which is also an interesting question when with interviews with Jewish people. And I would say this is the big treasure of this archive. This archive nowadays is not open to the public, but there is a program, and this is quite expensive, but there is a program that this archive should be a part of a bigger database of interviews and should then be reached also via the internet.
Thank you, Karl-Heinz. We do have a question from the audience. And Marianne, could you take this one? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. And this is an embarrassed question because I was late waiting for my test result to show up on my phone. So I only got to the very tail of this presentation. But thank you for that. So apropos voices, I was wondering if you could share with us a little bit more about how your interviewees may be reflecting on gaining back their voice, or not being asked and now being able to talk about their identities, their intersectional identities, and how this dynamic plays out in those interviews. Thank you so much.
Shall I answer quickly? I would say, well, the reactions are very, very different, and the interviews are really very different from each other. But I would say sometimes these people have kind of messages, to say, I was one of them. This was me who had this time and who had this kind of persecution. And especially, I would say, especially women who are not in the files of the archival holdings, of the state archival holdings, so often as men, because in Germany, the paragraph 175 only dealt with male homosexuality, but lesbian women had been persecuted too, but in totally other ways, which we are not able to fix so good as persecution of homosexual men. And especially these women who had been questioned and who had the possibility to open themselves in a whole day, in a protected room, I would say, they very often wanted to point out what they experienced, what was their feeling of othering or of being alienated. And this is very interesting, and this gives back this gives the future research and also the academic research. This gives the academic research questions how the researchers can research in archives and can have other questions for the archival holdings, and then would find files, I would say.
Thank you. And we do have another question from Eva, please.
So thank you so much for this very, very touching presentation. And it's really extremely important to do this work as you are doing now, and collecting these voices and give the right to tell the story. So both not just researching, but the kind of recognition of these victims as well. So congratulations. I can imagine how hard it is. I have two questions. The first one is whether you can take the advantage from other archival initiatives in Austria, in Hungary, in the Czech Republic. So as I'm not the expert of your research field, but I have some colleagues in Central Europe, and as I know, really unique oral history or life history research has been started in the past 10, 20 years. So do you have connection to these sources as well? Because I think it would be great to make a comparison with these sources. And the second question is rather an ethical one. I'm also an oral historian, and I conducted a couple of interviews in which homosexual abusement was the topic of the storytelling. How can we methodologically, theoretically, and even ethically integrate this type of violence in the Holocaust historiography? So do you have any idea how can we put these victims who were not LGBTIQ persons but were abused by the perpetrators? So what can we do with these individual stories we know? So thank you again. Thank you very much.
Noah, would you start with the more difficult question?
The ethical one. Yes, I can try to start with that question. For me, that is also a very important question, how to deal with those fundamental violence in perpetratorial context. Yeah, and I differentiated those actions on the bodies of inmates, of course not as homosexual acts, although we had that before as well on other talks. There, from a perspective of a perpetrator, there might be aspects of violence that is mixed with pleasure, and those aspects we need to focus very carefully on and in a very sensitive way. But also, I think it's important to address those things so that we can see more clearly what happened actually in the context, and also for giving back to the victims a frame for a situation of violence they've been in and have been facing. So this question is a very important one, but it's also, of course, very difficult to address through the files, because that's something that is not mentioned in files. Yeah, that is completely lost in protocols, maybe, and even in interviews. This aspect is, of course, in a context of shame as well, especially if So let's end here maybe. And but I see a lot of similarities, of course, to panels that have been previous here. And thank you for the question, Eva.
Maybe I can answer the first question and connect it with the second one. I'm working also as a freelancer historian, and when I worked in the Gay Museum in Berlin for a quite long time, we had a lot of relationships to Eastern Europe as far as as I studied Slavistics and I'm talking Russian. And I met several times with Irina Sherbakova from Memorial, this organization which has a hard time now in Russia, you know. And we met, I think, the first time 15 years ago, or I would say even maybe 20 years ago. And this was very constructive and this was very great. And we talked about how do they question their time witnesses. And I asked her, do you have any voices dedicated to homosexual acts, whether they had been kind of in harassment or otherwise? And she said, no, nearly nothing. And I asked her, do you have in your questioning lists, do they had lists with questions? And I asked her, do you have in your questioning lists the question, did you have homosexual or equal sex experiences, either on a free will or either in a harassment way? And she said, no, we don't have any questions like that on our list. So, I think this is the first step we as researchers and historians and sociologists should do, to include questions like that. And the time witnesses, they are not forced to answer this question or to react on this question, but they should know that there is a question like that and there is a room, and we are opening a room for questions like that. And if they want to, they can step into that room. And I think this is a very first thing we should do as people who are interrogating or not interrogating, who are questioning other people.
Thank you, everyone, for this very important input. And I'm looking around the room here in our audience, and I don't see any hands going up. And Sandro, we don't have any further questions in the chat. Okay, well then, all I can say is thank you so much, Noah and Karl-Heinz, for being with us today and for making the time. It was truly inspiring, and Grüße nach Stuttgart. Thanks for being with us. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a great workshop.
I think we will do a quick 5 minutes break just to also open up the windows, and then we will jump into our next panel.